So I have the hulls completely stripped of all sorts of stickers and adhesive, and I have epoxy all the gouges and things that I found along the way. But I'm going to sand the entire boat and prepare for priming.
In this video, we will review in some detail the process undertaken to prepare 9 lives for a new paint job on the hulls, and will feature our experiences using the Quantum 45 2-part epoxy primer from Engineered Marine Coatings. This process begins with the initial surface prep you see right now, sanding the gel coat with 220 and 320 grit sandpaper. Sanding the surface blends any epoxy repairs into a uniform finished height with the original gel coat and prepares the surface of the hulls to encourage the first layer of primer applied to form a strong bond.
Hey guys, so my shipment came in from Engineered Marine Coatings. Let's just go ahead and open these up and see what we got. This has a lot of tape. Okay, metal thing. These look like the mohair covers. These are 6.5-inch mohair cigar roller covers. These are for the primer specifically. Full wrap. All right. Okay, Quantum 45 epoxy activator. And looks like I have 4 cans of that, quart size. Because I did order a gallon. Okay. And then solvent reducer. Got 3 of these. And these are really for, well, let's see. This is epoxy reducer. Surface prep cleaner, slightly different. Okay, so 2 epoxy reducers, 1 solvent cleaner. And then, that's what this is for. Big old gallon of epoxy primer base. And a convenient carry handle. Well, the boat's been sitting a few days after we did our last epoxy and sanding job. So first thing I have to do before starting the primer coats is actually rinse the whole thing off. Really just trying to eliminate anything that might be lying loosely on the top sides so that it doesn't have the opportunity ultimately to make its way down to the sides. And then perhaps more importantly, to rinse all the dust off from all the sanding. Okay, I'm about to get started with the first coat of primer on both hulls. First order of business really is to go back and check things like where I've made my tape line. Obviously there's a couple areas that need to be fixed, so I'm gonna go back over that with some new tape. Then I need to mask kind of the underside of all the rub rail areas because they all could use a little bit of tape just so we don't get paint all over the rub rail. Here we go with the new edge. And then at the stern here, where the side of the hull meets the transom, it's going to be blue on the hull side and then white on the transom side. So I need to mask off the dividing line between the hull side and the transom. The way I've decided to transition this is I took the entire curve and I decided that's going to be blue, and then the transom itself will be white. So it's a lot of eyeballing and careful tape stretching, but I made sure that the entirety of the curve will end up getting, in this case, primer and then blue paint. For the bottoms of the rub rails, I'm just going to use this standard masking tape instead of the blue stuff. I really wanted to put the boat closer to the water. Instead, is that the train going by is going to kick up a lot of dust. So my plan, really, is to wait for a train to go by, do the wipe down, and then paint. And I gotta hope that the paint will skin over before the next train goes by and kicks up more dust. Okay, so my first step is I'm going to wipe the boat down. So I'm going to do a wipe on with this surface prep cleaner and then wipe off with a clean rag. And then I have prepared here for my first coat of primer. I've got the epoxy primer base. I've got the epoxy activator, and so I'm going to mix those in a quantity of 1:1. And then I also have an epoxy reducer, which technically is not necessary, but I could choose to add that if I want to reduce it a bit up to a 25% volume, but don't necessarily need to do that. And then just for safety's sake here, I have my respirator, got some goggles, and I've got some gloves because I really don't want to get this stuff on my skin too much. And this does say harmful if inhaled, so I'm going to use the respirator for sure, even while I'm wiping down the boat. So it's going to be 1 equal part of the base, 1 equal part of the activator, and then a little bit of reducer if I want it. So we'll see. I use solo cups so I can get the same amount. Actually going to go with something a little bit longer so we can make sure we get everything off the bottom. Oh yeah, there's some goopy solids down there.
A better paint mixer would have helped immensely.
See that stuff?
Cue the better paint mixer.
He's good at mixing and good looking too.
Sticking my tongue out at you.
All right, well let's make some paint. Should have grabbed one of those pouring things. Oh, should have grabbed one of those pouring things. Should have grabbed one of those. Should have grabbed one of those. Should have grabbed one of those pouring things. Oh. We do everything scientifically, in a very clean way. No, this doesn't need to be stirred. I'm just going to use the same mark.
A little higher.
Yeah. Okay. Got my paint bucket, got a liner, so I don't have to clean anything. Because obviously I do everything as clean as possible. If I was doing this right, I'd have larger cups and I would actually stir this in a cup. But right now, I'm going to stir it in the bucket. So, I've mixed the two parts together. I really have to let it sit in duct, I guess they call it, for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, somewhere in that time frame. So just let it sit and cook, basically. Then I can add a bit of reducer, and then we can start painting the boat. So, let's wait.
So we're doing a color change on the boat. It's a white boat, and we're going to make it a blue boat. And we had to go with a gray primer because we don't want any of the white to show through. So we have to go with a bit of a darker primer. We got to do about 3 coats of primer. So right now we're on our first. It's taking a little bit longer than we expected because the primer is super sticky. So we can't roll it out like you would painting a house or anything that you would paint, I guess. So we are going to do probably 1 hole today. Luckily it's the summertime, so the sun won't set for a little while. I have to wear this Darth Vader mask because it's very toxic paint. and I don't want to breathe it in, so this is what I'm gonna do.
Okay, so a few observations now that we've primed one of the two hulls, or at least made our first pass. So the amount of primer that I mixed up was adequate. Almost actually a little too much, but not by a lot. So when I do the second hull for the first time, I'm going to mix up just about the same amount, maybe a little bit less. Ripes. So I would not tend to use reducer. I didn't use any this time. I just mixed the primer base and the activator together, and it went on very thin. So I think adding a reducer would probably make it even thinner. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed unnecessary. So I don't think I would do that. Applied thick enough, and I did a little experimenting up just below the rub rail on that one hull. I added a bit more. Added thick enough. The pigment definitely is adequate for hiding. So you put enough primer on, it's going to be battleship gray through and through. So that's good, because I do plan on doing at least 2, probably 3, who knows, maybe 4 coats of primer with or without sanding in between. Not entirely sure, but we'll see. Depends on how time goes on. Pretty happy with the primer itself. Not so happy with the mohair rollers that I was recommended to use to apply it. In fact, only one of them fell apart, but when it did, it was a disaster. The second one seemed to hold together pretty well, so maybe it was a fluke. I don't know. But in any case, I'll add subsequent layers of primer and we'll sand it down, and all those little flaws should go away.
Who rolls on primer? Why not spray it? We have had a lot of people question our choice here about both the primer and the top coat layers of paint. It had nothing to do with skills. Duke has painted cars before with spray equipment. It really came down to rules at the marina prohibiting painting with a sprayer. So we chose a paint system by Engineered Marine Coatings that promised good results with the roller application, no tipping needed. And it turns out that was sort of almost accurate.
Okay, lessons learned today. And this is a lesson I've learned time and time again. First and foremost, regardless of how much I estimate a project is going to take, I should always at least triple it. I came down here today thinking, hey, it's not raining. It's not even humid today. Sweet. I have enough time this evening to clean both hulls and prime both hulls. And I didn't have time to prime both hulls. So I'll come back in the morning and I will prime the second hull. And that should be fine. Other things, don't forget gloves. I now have primer all over me. Make sure you have enough rollers. Luckily, this one didn't fall apart on me this time, and I didn't have to use this foam one I have as a backup. Let's see if I can find some more of these locally. Otherwise, I'm using the foam. Oh, here's something. So, use of reducer with the two-part epoxy primer. I put enough in so that the consistency, at least initially, was like skim milk. And I was a little worried at first that it was too thin, but it went on very nicely. And I think that's what I'm going to do for the third coat if I decide to do one. And I probably will. So my shopping list is gloves, mohair rollers, 6.5 inch if I can find them. Oh, and little foam brushes, because I just used up my last foam brush as well. Okay, got myself some nitrile gloves, which actually are better than the latex ones I was using last time, because these are resistant to solvent, so shouldn't break when I'm doing the cleaning. These are the closest things I found to the mohair rollers. 6 inch, these are microfiber, and they're basically good for smooth to semi-smooth surfaces. I don't know, I'm gonna give it a shot. If these don't work, I'm just gonna use the foam. And then foam brush, stack of those. Let's prime this other hull.
One thing worth noting, as we applied subsequent coats of primer, we reapplied masking tape to the edges before rolling on the new coat, and then removed it once the coat was applied. This prevents the problem of having to remove tape from cured primer and risking a fouled edge. We also sanded a bit between coats.
A couple things to note. The reducer is a solvent, and obviously I measured it out in this cup. And you can see the residue of that being in the cup is slowly eating it away. I picked up a bunch of new foam brushes. I just stopped by Tractor Supply. I figured they'd have them, and they did. I don't know, these look just like the ones that I had purchased from the Home Depot, but these ones just fell apart rapidly. Merit Pro Paint Foam Brush. Seems like crap. These microfiber rollers, it's obviously a larger diameter, but about the same length as those mohair rollers I was using. These seem to absorb a bit more paint, but that was fine. Slightly thicker nap on them, but that didn't seem to really affect the overall finish much, if at all. So, microfiber rollers, as good as the mohair. Sorry, little guy. I find other things like right here, a little divot that I didn't fill. I'll fill that with epoxy. And then there's little pinholes. I went around and filled all the pinholes I could find, and I always find more. There's a pretty good pinhole right there in the bow.
Between coats of primer and before sanding again, we looked for imperfections in the surface, like pinholes in the gel coat, and filled them with epoxy. We always seemed to find more. With imperfections filled with the epoxy and everything sanded down again, it was time to apply our third coat of primer.
Hopefully this is the last time we prime this boat. Well, final sanding of the final coat of primer before I lay down paint. Final sanding, I hope. Because I don't want to risk blowing through the primer, I'm actually sanding everything manually, by hand. Because when I laid down the primer and then sanded it in previous coats with the machine, there were a couple areas where I blew through the primer accidentally. So I'm going to try to take the slow route and avoid doing that. Back at it. I only have an hour to kill this evening, but I'm working on the concave curve here underneath the bow rail. Just doing it with finger pressure, 220 grit sandpaper. And the ultimate goal here is, if you look, I'm not quite done yet here, but I'm just knocking down all the high points left by the roller. And ultimately I want to get everything to a uniform light gray color. That way I know that it's all at the same level. I'm going to probably do a second pass even along this concave surface, because I'm not really at the level where I need to be yet. Well, it's really hot out. I just finished doing everything here right below the rub rail. We got this concave surface. I did it in a crosshatch pattern, so two directions. I'm sure when I rinse all the dust off, I'll probably want to go back and do one more pass. But what I'm trying to do is do everything manually with just scrap pieces of 220 and knock off all the little raised areas left behind by applying the primer with a roller. I really just want to scratch it down to as level as I can, and then, you know, scratch it down to allow for mechanical keying of the top coat to the primer. This is probably the hardest part. I can use something flat with a sanding block, I think, over these larger areas. But pain in the ass. Talk about wavy. Yikes. Boat definitely has waves in it. This is just my first quick go over with the sanding pad. I'm quite confident that the majority of the variation here that we're seeing is from the rollers themselves leaving marks. And I say that because I've got some pretty well defined lines here. So I think as I go over this 2 or 3 times from different directions, I should be able to knock most of that down. So I'm not feeling too bad about this. Well guys, I managed to do one light pass over all the prime surfaces on this boat with this 3M sanding pad, some 220 grit sanding paper. I probably have at least 2 more passes going in different directions and such. I'm not sure if this is worth it. Maybe it's better to just use the power sanders. I don't know. I just don't want to blow through the primer. So, whether it's worth it or not, I'm going to finish this by hand and see how it comes out. Well, I'm finished with sanding the final coat of primer with 220 grit paper. Hand sanded it. To the touch, it feels very smooth. I can still see little freckles. They look like freckles left over by the nap of the rollers. And I mean, if I really try, I can feel them, but they're very, very subtle. When I rinsed the dust off with water, can't see them anymore. I look at it from an angle and I think I can get a general idea of what it'll look like with kind of a high gloss top coat. And those little freckles can't be seen at that point. So I'm fairly confident that when I put 2 or 3 layers of top coat on, sand it, and then apply a clear, it's gonna be pretty smooth, I think. Anyway, I'm exhausted. I think I'm done. Mosquitoes are having a feast.